All right, recording. All right, hello everybody and welcome. So this is going to be initially a little panel discussion. I've decided to call it CP on the ground. The reason for that is that this was sort of born in, a question that I floated on a Telegram thread with all of you, and I was just curious to hear from some folks who have been involved in collective presencing online for a while and have felt the impulse and have even stepped into, in different contexts, hosting the practice of collective presencing in person. And it seems like there is some interest in that in the wider group. So it seemed prudent to maybe have a recorded call, maybe have some folks on here to open that discussion for the learning and benefit kind of everybody who feels a calling toward collective presencing. So the way I envision this unfolding is I've just got some basic questions lined up that can just sort of get the discussion rolling. Brandon's here as he's been a bit of a co-host. He's tech hosting right now and just kind of been supporting this coming together. I also know he's been a bit involved with what Sabra and Michael have been up to. So if anything wants to come through, Brandon, feel free to jump in and add it if you feel called. And I've gathered just kind of 4 clusters of kind of prompts that I think will get us started. And probably elicit different perspectives on what you all have been doing so far. And however much time that takes, we'll kind of glide through those, and then we can open up the room after that and see if other folks present have questions or things they'd like to field into the space. All right, how's that sound? Yep. Okay, awesome. Just to jump in here, to start, I'm curious about getting a little bit more insight into both the context in which all of you have been calling in-person collective presencing endeavors and the motivation underlying it. So maybe we can just kind of go around and invite everybody to share a little bit about what they've done so far and the either desire or motivation or sense of calling that was underlying that impulse to do so. And we can just kind of popcorn it between all of you who are here.
Yeah, I'll start. So I'm Michael. I've been hosting in Portland, Maine with Sabra and sometimes with Brandon. Since the end of last year, I don't know exactly when we started, maybe November, something like that. And have been doing basically once a month since then. I think we took a month off. I'll maybe let Sabra talk more to some of the context part, because we brought the practice to an existing community. So there was kind of like a field into which we entered and introduced this practice. Actually, Sabra was an essential part of that field. I sort of showed up a little bit more. And motivation wise, I used to facilitate a lot of different kinds of relational and intersubjective practices in New York City back in 2012 or 11, 12, 13, 14, in that range. And I was aware of RIA and collective presencing, but I had never done it. And then my life took me in a bunch of different directions, and I sort of lost contact with that field of practice for a while. But it always was deeply influential in how I thought about everything else I was doing. And then during the pandemic, discovered the online collective presencing community. I think partly through Nick Shore, and that kind of like reawakened my dormant passion for space practice. And then as the pandemic eased and I found myself longing for more in-person connection and community and practice time, I sort of reached out to Sabra in particular because I went on the website of this community that I had known about, and I saw that she had been facilitating something she called relational practice, and I just kind of figured she would understand what I was talking about and might be interested in helping me get something going there. And then I notified Ria that I was wanting to do this, and she was like, well, you should definitely have a co-host, and there's a couple of other people who are also wanting to do this in person wherever they are, and it'd be cool if you guys have a conversation, and you should also maybe work with one of the more experienced practitioners as a kind of a mentor. And so I had a call with John and also with, I think it was Marianne, I can't remember exactly. And then I pinged Brandon and I said, would you be interested in being our mentor? And he said yes, very generously. And it's kind of gone from there. And it's been really beautiful. And yeah, we're like coming up on a year of it. And I'm sensing like a next iteration is ripening.
Michael, looks like you've frozen here. Give it a little moment and see if he comes back. There you are. We missed the last part of your statement there. It froze for a second.
Where'd you lose me? Sorry.
You were just mentioning kind of tying off.
Next iteration.
You're up at 1 year.
Yeah, I'm feeling like a next iteration is bubbling, and I'm feeling excited about that, and yeah, would love to dive more into that at some point with you all, but I'll leave it there for now.
Okay, thanks, Michael. And since you'd kind of invoked Sabra and you two were doing this together, Sabra, I'm wondering if you want to kind of pick up on that.
Sure. Let's see if there's any holes to fill, other perspectives to add. So this community, I landed in Portland a few years back and landed with a healing circle called Good Medicine. And it's a circle of different kinds of healing practitioners. So I was offering relational practice, just dyads and triads. So it was like a group would show up, but we would always break out into dyads and triads. That practice was based on like just reporting, just tracking the internal experience out loud to another. And it has been a powerful practice for me in my life. Been a big cause of a lot of transformation. But it was slow going in the year that I offered it. And so after a year, I was like, okay, I'm going to put this down for now. I'm not sure that people are ready for it. and I'm tired of offering this alone. So put it to rest, and it was kind of right at that point that Michael approached me, and it felt just right. It felt like that work is really important and useful, but I was quite interested in doing group work, especially having lived for a year with this community. So bringing the relational practice, into group space. And like I wanted to work with someone else. I was tired of doing it alone. And that was a big thing that we were starting to look at in the community, was like collaboration being a real important foundation. Yeah, it's been powerful. It's been really, really beautiful, and it feels really good right now. I think there was it's funny to think back to like when we asked Brandon to be our mentor, and like I didn't know him yet and was sort of expecting this more like hierarchical teacher thing, and like it's become a really beautiful like three-way friendship and conversation and inquiry, and starting to engage more in the online CP and kind of like feel the breadth of this community, and learn a lot more, even though I've learned so much by hosting live. Yeah, thanks.
All right, thanks, Sabra. There's been so many juicy little things that have popped up already that have roused a lot of curiosity. But before I've tagged those things, but just want to, I'm curious here from Amanda and John, the kind of context in which you've done this, kind of motivation, calling, desire. What was there?
Yeah, I can share. I feel a little bit of imposter syndrome being in this panel, actually, because I haven't been hosting regular in-person sessions. I just had one experience of trying to bring collective presencing to a community project that I was part of since, when was it? I think it was the end of last year. And we also had, in the beginning, we were meeting, it was 3 people, and we were meeting online first. And we also asked the help of Nick, and Nick was a sort of mentor for us in some sorts of, and then we did a few online sessions using collective presencing that really worked well. We had like a specific inquiry question that, for example, around the economic models that we were contemplating, for example, and then that really worked well. And we had different sessions, like I think we had 3 online sessions with different teams that we were exploring, and it was a very initial phase of like just exploring some possibilities. And then we met in person in Portugal. It was May. And then it was interesting because someone else outside this triad joined us, and he was not part of our process before. So there was like some kind of shock. He was not so interested in doing those practices. So it became much more challenging to do it in person, also because we were living together, and the interpersonal intensities became bigger than our capacity to practice and just stay in the practice. And I felt also a little bit lonely in the practice, because I was, even though we practiced a little bit before online, no one there was like a practitioner, a regular practitioner. And so I think I just have a few examples of what not to do and what doesn't work. My only other experience doing it in person was in the retreat in Brazil. And there was one session, one day we did a whole morning or a whole afternoon, I don't remember, of collective presencing, and that was like a formal session, like with all the protocols. And I think there's a tension here between, in my experience, a tension between doing it, the practice following protocols, and leaving the practice as something that goes beyond a session with boundaries, like, oh, this is just a 1 hour session. No, because living together with the group, it's like, it's almost all the time a feeling of, when I'm picking up the piece or when I'm called to do something.
Did anybody else lose Amanda's audio? Yeah, audio.
Yeah. When I was called to do something, that was the last thing that you said.
Yeah, I think there's just this distinction to be made, that I'm also learning how to navigate, and how far does the practice go, when it comes to doing things, especially in community when people are living together. I think that's a big thing to explore.
So I'm already hearing some themes clustering here that actually might inform the way that this continues to unfold. But before we maybe click on some of those things, John, I'd like to just invite you to kind of maybe share what your endeavor was like. Quite curious.
I'm curious to ask a question in return. Will you be asking follow-up questions regarding the details of some things that were gleaned, learned, and all of that? Or is this something that you're looking for me possibly to express right now?
Yeah, if that stuff wants to come through right now, by all means, kind of share. Like, if going into the context and the motivations that wants to come through, like, hold it back. But I was planning on going into some of those things, but
Okay.
it doesn't have to.
I'll hold back. I can share the spirit that was alive back then, through which I was both motivated and inspired to bring this into the in-person scene. It was a few streams flowing in the same direction. One of them being all the amazing healing that I personally found from this practice, the cultivation of the long, arduous, but eventual cultivation of being able to express and voice out things that in so many settings I never had it in me or felt could be possible. And I was sensing that there was a great potential of what could come about when more people engage in a practice that is both healing, loving, and affordance of gleaning into wisdom nuggets or whatever is sparked up from the middle as a result of dialogue. So one of the frames that I had, because at the same time another stream was the meta crisis, which was a really big thing last year, it seemed, with all those videos of Daniel Schmachtenberger and whatnot. And one of the frames that I came about with was the frame of us humans so much so growing to have the power of God through exponential technology, but not having the love or wisdom of them. And I was framing it in such a way that there are many practices that I've been exposed to that are in the cultivation that have an emphasis in the cultivation of wisdom, and some others in the cultivation of love. And collective pensing, for me, I felt had a good balance of both. And there was this spirit of eagerness. I've been told bravado and urgency, through which I was inspired at that time to bring it in. And it's like, I bring it in no matter what. that kind of energy, like, all right, reach out to people, do all this, get it done. And I had help with many folks. One folk here today, David, was my mentor. And some other folks too were very helpful and supportive in the whole process. In terms of the co-hosting, I did not have a core practitioner as a regular co-host. So the co-hosts that was with me were people that I trust and were great friends of mine. And though they didn't have that much experience, I would say that they could hold space. The event was held in 2-month intervals for each season, fall, winter, and spring. The circles had their own theme for each, and it was more of a like a progression as well. As the seasons unfolded, different elements were also added on. But then I stopped after the spring. And I'm curious about my own thing. Shall I stop the story? Just so we could go on to the next set of questions.
Just one quick follow-up
Yeah.
question, John, just because I'm curious, were these 3 sessions, was it a set group of people who were coming, or were they kind of open drop-in?
There was some people that came for all 3, but it was each circle ranged from 8 to 12. And sometimes it's like there's scheduling conflicts for those who couldn't make it. But I've noticed one thing in particular. Even though it was promoted on one of my friends' larger community things on Instagram, the people that came were all people that have met me in person. It wasn't like any random person that just showed up. Even though it was promoted to a large audience, it was people who met me in person, and also people who have a proclivity for a practice like this, which was one thing that's very key to note. And it was also a puzzle for me. What can attract it to other folks without also diluting the frame that I was presenting it as? Unless I was getting to a point like, do I want to switch the frame and say, oh, it's put into a way that's like, okay, this could speak to a very general audience. And I didn't get to that point yet. It's the spring.
Okay, so just want to highlight a couple things that I'm hearing. One thing that's been coming in quite a lot is the structure of support from getting support from mentors or people who are kind of been close to what we've been calling the core practitioner field. There's maybe some kind of main line of connection and support and vitality for venturing out and doing these things. That's been standing out as something that's been sounding important. And this has been part of one of the questions that's been alive is the integrity within the kind of field of what we're calling collective presencing and how we're relating to those who have more experience. Jenna, I'll share something that Jenna had shared over email, which was just observing that, she shared that she has a hypothesis that the transmission of collective presencing maybe is best shared by those who are more experienced practitioners who have actually spent time in collective presencing fields for a while to have kind of internalized that sensibility or that way of holding holding a field that then gets kind of conveyed or is shown by example. She was curious what everyone thinks about that hypothesis, but I'm just kind of, at least so far, noting that there's something in the structure of support from the core group that sounds important here. Yeah, and there's also been some diversity here. It sounds like, you know, John was grappling with very large, you know, these kind of meta crisis questions, like, you know, as big of a context as we can grapple with, probably relevantly as human beings right now, and inviting folks into that. Whereas in Amanda's case, it sounds like there were certain needs in a particular community that you were engaged with that were kind of collective presencing maybe being brought in service of those things. And then in the case of Michael, sounds like you were joining in with Sabra in a kind of community context in which Sabra was already embedded. And on that note, I'd, you know, maybe just like to invite Sabra to come forward a little bit, and Michael, if anything, is just relevant in terms of like, was there a specific need or a kind of specific dimension to what was going on in the community that these practices were being brought in to address, or was it more just to kind of bring in the practice for its own sake?
Yeah, it's an interesting question in this context, because the offerings of this community, this happened with the relational practice that I was offering. I was in leadership and like community organizing with this community. And so the offerings, I really wanted the providers. We were working on cultivating community amongst ourselves, and providers were working with people coming in. And so I really thought it would be best if providers, you know, if these were open to the public, but also providers participated, but they didn't have time. You know, it's like everyone's so busy. And so mostly it was, people outside of the direct circle who were coming to these offerings. That has continued in the collective, that was true for relational practice, that has continued with collective presencing. It's not so much the circle of providers, it's other people and friends and extended community. And in the duration that we've been hosting collective presencing, a huge crisis happened in the community. And yeah, just like a humans being human, I got laid off, like it exploded. During that time, or kind of like in the aftermath, when the community, the circle of providers, was trying to figure out, like, heal and kind of like figure out how to not just disperse, is it possible to get through this? Michael and I were like, you might use this practice. We were also using sort of more like prompts relevant to the larger collective field. And we were like, I think this, like, if they were open to it, we could share this with the providers, because this might be like helpful for exactly the moment that they're in trying to organize themselves. And that has been an interesting inquiry for us of like, oh, this is useful for feeling into, what humans need right now. And it's also useful for governance, and community, like, organizing itself. But what you were talking about, Amanda, is really interesting, because also I was like, yeah, and it can get too hot and too entangled. So.
And just a quick, Amanda had a question just to clarify of what you had meant by providers in that context, just to bring that forward.
Sure. The good medicine is a circle of like individual healers, offering different healing modes, and they are called providers. Great,
thank you. And yeah, so I'm hearing that there are a kind of there's like a gradient of context within like intimacy within the community. Like if it's more tightly knit, the daily living, all the pressures that come with the relationships when you're more tightly embedded can put pressure on the container, whereas where there's more maybe a little bit less of that tight knittedness, there's less of that pressure. Yeah, Amanda.
Yeah, I just wanted to share additionally to what has been said already. I think in our case, we were actually holding the question, what if we could create a community from like starting from the beginning with the practice and through the practice almost, because yeah, that was one of our hypotheses, like because yeah, maybe all of you know there are so many different ways of starting a community, so many different yeah ways of leadership, and we were holding that question like generally as a, well, what if like this practice could be like the container in which the community itself comes alive. And that was, I still hold that question. I didn't refuse my hypothesis. I still wonder. It's not like I'm committed to this research question now, but I still wonder about this.
Yeah, I'm having thoughts related about my sense of the relationship between this practice and community in general, and this particular community where we've been hosting the practice. Good medicine has as its sort of mission statement something along the lines of collective healing and cultural change, or like raising consciousness, and Sabra probably knows it better than me, but you know, they're in the conversation of the meta crisis already, you know, even if they don't necessarily use that language. And so that's part of why I went there first, as like a potential place to see if it could host this forum, right? And then finding Sabra within that, already doing relational practice, there was like a groove that this like slipped into, you know. And my sense is that we're still learning about what it could mean to be in community in the spirit of community as solution for, or like response to, the meta crisis. Like that's a kind of a new conception of community that's like emerging in parallel with the conditions in which we're asking that question, you know. And so for me, collective presencing is a way of experiencing a possibility of what it could be like to be in relationship with each other that is like kind of rare, you know. You don't encounter that way of being, that way of relating in too many places. And so to introduce that to a group of people who are already on their own kind of leading edge and trying to move in a particular direction together felt really potent and interesting and exciting to me. And one of the things that I've really catches my attention in an ongoing way is the difference of doing the practice with people that I see in other contexts on a regular basis, and who have other relational dynamics and overlaps going on all the time that are like present in the space. It's like that piece about practicing after the 90 minutes are done, you know? So it's like the boundary around the circle is porous. And I'm really curious over time how the cultivation of that container and that field like ripples out into the rest of what that community is doing and the relationships between those people, you know. No, there's no co-living dimension. It's a regional community, you know, kind of centered around Portland where we live, but extending some amount of space. But there is a physical space that kind of anchors that, and that's where we've been doing the practice. But in the wake of this crisis, you know, we're also like, yeah, it's unclear what the role of that place will be or how the community will evolve. And we have other physical places that are sort of also becoming nodes in this ecosystem. It's also interesting.
Yeah, this is opening up a lot of richness around context, motivation, and what doing this practice might actually mean as it starts landing on the ground, right? And having it be a bounded, well-defined thing or something that we're training that might be more pervasive as we start rooting into community. So it's been profoundly rich. Maybe one more question just to elicit some things for the field before I noticed like an eagerness to open up to the collective wisdom of the group is starting to bubble up in me here. But one thing, and this is, you know, I know Amanda had mentioned a little bit about this earlier, maybe it's already been kind of spoken to, but I'm just curious about the learnings, like takeaways from, you know, what modest endeavors have been done so far, if there are things that seem to have been to work well, that you carry forward into how you will bring these practices, and if there were things that, you know, where the hiccups were or challenges that have come up that also inform maybe what doesn't work so well or things to look out for in terms of bringing this practice elsewhere.
Yeah, I can start since I've already shared a little bit. For me, the biggest learning was about preparation. There is that saying like a proper prior preparation prevents poor peace performance, something like that. One of my mentors told me right when I started hosting stuff. And it's still one of my biggest learnings. And preparation involves the framing, the question, all this context, understanding the context, understanding the group, the space, what is available, and coming prepared. And many times, like my worst experience was when I called a meeting because I saw a need for a conversation to happen and I didn't prepare at all. I just came to the meeting, and that was when I realized like, wow, I could prepare it and I could frame and I could really set everyone in this thing that we do as hosts, like really welcoming everyone in the beginning and all this like massage in the field, like is yeah, I'll leave it there for now.
I can share like my favorite learning so far, which is that the feeling of collective presencing takes some getting used to for people who are showing up for the first time and have never done something like that before, you know, kind of come because they're your friend and they want to support you, but they don't really know what it is or what it's about. And yeah, there's some like inherent awkwardness, I think, that often shows up. And what we've seen happen a few times is when that is invited, at least like energetically, you know, like there's a kind of subtle opening for that to be expressed, as well as maybe something said about it in the framing, you know, gently. And people get to have the experience of voicing their doubts and concerns and resistances and discomforts and confusions, and the field, and then they like see that the field can hold that and that it actually is welcome. That actually is what creates the sense of like trust and resonance and kind of being able to settle in. So there's this kind of wobbly dissonant phase that as a host and as a person who like wants people to like my thing and come back next time, made me a little nervous sometimes, you know. But like practicing in myself, trusting the field and just holding space and working with my own discomfort as I'm listening to these people share their discomfort, it unfolds in a really beautiful way. And that has felt like a really nice teaching from the field. I appreciate having that experience.
Yeah, I was wondering if you're gonna share the same thing. I was gonna talk about that too. And kind of like another, just to add to it, or another aspect, it actually feels very connected to relational practice, the relational practice that I was doing, which like in a lot of ways felt like this kind of like honing the vessel to hold whatever arises, whatever energy is moving through, and that like we don't really come with that skill. We get overwhelmed really easily by our experience, and yeah, some of the like inherent tension of like doing something new or not understanding what's happening, it has felt like us as a container honing ourselves, like, can the container hold this tension? And yeah, when enough bodies say yes, you know, like turn towards and are sturdy enough to hold the tension, trust grows there. And so that's been super beautiful. And I think that there's also been for me this like you know, enough people who've done it enough times and show up like calm and confident and engaged, like you can see how like now, you know, like 3 times in and we were good. Like there were enough people who were coming who sort of like had both the like regulated nervous system and like the language or the know-how, and like there was just enough of like the group body was regulated and modeling how to do it, and like from there it feels like the space kind of carries the practice. It also like feels to me like the instructions, like the guidance, it's like really sweet to like that it's like given every time. It's really this like invitation for like this space is always open to newcomers, and it's kind of like give as little as possible because people can't hear it all. They can't take it all in. They're kind of spacing out, and it's more this kind of like just diving in and watching it be modeled.
I like to resonate with the previous two shares, that there is this awkward energy that arises when beginner practitioners get exposed to someone sharing something very deep and vulnerable, and then this flat line of silence happens, and they're like, what next? What the fuck next? Like there's like a question of like, what do I say? Like I think it's the energy's like, from what I'm sensing from the group, like, what do I say to this? What do I say about this? Like, who's gonna say something after that? And I think it's like it's the process of learning to lean in and trust in the capacity to co-hold the circle. And people are just like learning those muscles when something like that happens. But it was amusing and fascinating to witness it. There was two things that I found to be helpful or key takeaways. It's at least from my end, there's sustainability. How can this be something that is sustainable? And it's on one end, as the person that was initiating, it's like what kind of support from the people in person. How there's a part of me that just longed for another core practitioner to join me in on this. But also more so on the financial side. That was one of the things that made me lean towards like I first to do it in 2-month intervals, because the studio rental was in Toronto wasn't something that could work on my end if I kept on doing it in a more regular basis. So despite later on holding like an event fee would still not reach whatever the studio rent was for that amount of time. So I covered the rest. And so like that the support and the sorting out the financial side is I found to be very important. And eventually by the end of spring, there was actually quite a bit of momentum, because I reached out to some folks and they were already, some people who couldn't make it were already showing interest in the next thing, like just invite me to the next thing. But then it's like, this is the takeaway from the initiators who would wish to do this themselves, is there's some things that just come up in life. And for me, I had a juncture where I wanted to enter into an inward journey and move away from all the community participation. And I did that for about 7 to 8 weeks. I called it my journey to the underworld. And when I came out of it, the energy for bringing CP in was a bit more sober. I shared the quote from the King, Warrior, and Magician of it with other folks about the hero, the heroic consciousness. And if I can only analogize how the spirit of it was very much on the heroic consciousness side in the beginning of about nearly a year ago. And then the end cycle of the hero is the hero has to die and realize that there are key lessons in limitations and in humility. And so one thing that I want to hold close to me as if I were to go step in again is I'm working to build certain capacities that through which this practice would be sustainable on the financial and also on the energetic end of things. So in the capacity of holding the space, co-leading, and doing all that.
Yeah, sobering the hero. It's been helpful. We have questions being raised around structure, venue, sustainability, both where fiscal matters come into play, but the energetic component, I think that's probably where the community and the support really come in. But also, I was feeling in relation to this tending to awkwardness that had so much resonance. I also noted this kind of it seemed like a kind of giddy humor emerged when that topic started coming up too, which is actually kind of beautiful. So yeah, I'm hoping that this having this discussion for those who view it might help support people in kind of confronting that initial kind of tender awkwardness that might emerge when venturing out to do this in different settings, particularly maybe less anonymous or more rooted in ongoing relationships that have much more enduring, persistent, shared context to them. I feel like we're just scratching the surface here. There's so much richness in all of this, but I notice I'm very curious where some other folks' curiosities might be and places on the surface other people might want to inquire into. So yeah, I kind of want to invite everybody on the call to maybe turn their cameras on if they feel called and just want to see what other questions, curiosities might have emerged from all of this and open the floor for people to field inquiries if they have them.
I just got this impulse, so. I think the question comes from this recognition that I have that there is that awkward tension when people who are not familiar with a dialogue practice end up in the same room together doing a dialogue practice for the first time. I also believe that it's not for everybody to do collective presencing. So when that kind of tension emerges, when you're moving it out into a larger community, and this is the direct question, how do you deal with speaking across the fire when that tension emerges? And the side question is, my sense in what I've been experiencing in collective presencing is that we're transitioning to a time where we're kind of sliding across the circle more and more. Peace down.
I'll pick up. Yeah, there's like a thread that's been lingering for me from the last round that feels related to this question. It's maybe not a direct answer, but you know, in the spirit of CP, let's go with it. In terms of like the motivation piece and the context, yeah, like one of my hypotheses is the longing that I experience for being in a certain kind of relational field is something that's expressing itself through many bodies right now. And I think our first prompt actually that we used was like something about longing. And the reason we chose it was that we wanted to invite people into both their own experience of that, but also the shared experience of it, like to be in a circle together where we could all presence the fact that that was true, and to explore how that was for each of us, but also to have the recognition, maybe for the first time, you know, I don't know, or like it's always kind of fresh and interesting to see it as a collective experience, you know, and be in relationship to it as a collective experience in real time. So I feel like that I feel solid in that kind of assumption, or, you know, like that's my experience, you know, I've seen that, I've encountered that, I feel like that's true. I also feel like collective presencing is not the only way to get to that, you know, and it's a form that I really appreciate because of its flexibility and resilience, and kind of like it's hard to describe what it isness. It's malleable, you know, and I think for that reason it actually does work kind of well as a way to like introduce people to that kind of an experience. And what I was saying at the beginning about feeling like there's a next iteration starting to bubble up, part of that is about what other forms might be useful here to support the underlying impulse of what we're attempting to do through the form of collective presencing, right? And part of that is also like, yeah, this piece you named, Sam, or I guess it came from the email, but like, how do we honor and like maintain the integrity of collective presencing, whatever that is, and also like meet people where they are and adapt it for different contexts, and continue to iterate and innovate and all of that, you know? So yeah, that all feels very alive to me, and like current, you know? This is like an inquiry that we're very much in this moment. But I feel in general like there are some people who have shown up, kind of like clicked in, and like it's for them, you know? And then I feel like there's other people where maybe this isn't for them exactly, but they're not, it's not like totally not for them either. And so I think there's something about, yeah, that idea of like an ecology of practices, and the way that different forms can support each other and cast a little bit of a wider net for people to, you know, kind of come through different doorways, but end up in a similar space together, something like that.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up this question, feel like it taps for me kind of an older question, like a question we were already working with at Good Medicine, and that I feel like I've worked with in the Dharma space as well, kind of like around capacity and trauma. And noticing that like, yeah, like what relational practice that I was offering Rose is kind of a skill to track your internal experience and find language to articulate it. And in offering that, I realized like, whoa, a lot of people don't have this at all, like at all. And it almost feels like a precursor for collective presencing. And then there's a whole sort of relational capacity about like a readiness to merge that kind of like is dependent on like that very significant trauma prevents, I think, can really complicate. And so that for me, with Good Medicine, we had a lot of people walking in the door. You know, there was psychedelic work going on there. So a lot of who we were calling in was the most traumatized. And then these offerings, it actually was not a good fit. Those folks who had high trauma, like can't even feel a sense of belonging in the room. They don't have kind of some of the internal awareness and tracking. There is not like a basic sort of relational skills. So is it not for them? You know, but like the practice can't quite take off without some of that foundation. So that brings up some interesting, that's been an interesting inquiry for us of like seeing that some of the tension that arose is people just not knowing, not feeling oriented, and that like that will always in any space we walk into bring tension and discomfort and like maybe I just shouldn't have come. And then there's a whole another level of like people who have come in and sort of like attacked the space or really not felt safe. And that kind of like almost like stops the practice for a minute. It kind of asks the circle to like pause and tend to that. And we're not really practicing anymore, you know, it's like we're tending. And there's sort of a different thing going on. Yeah, so that's some of what comes up in response, David.
Yeah, I think I'll share following Sabra's. Yeah, I had an experience also with someone that wanted to join the gathering in Brazil. She's Brazilian, and she was a friend of the owner of the house where we did the retreat. And at first, she seemed like a very good fit for the practice. But later, like in interactions with her, I realized that she actually suffered from, she just told me basically her diagnosis, which was very complicated, and I actually, yeah, she ended up not coming to, she decided to not come. But I think even if she hadn't decided, I probably would have asked her. I don't know. I realize there's a big edge here in terms of mental health in general, and these healing practices that we do, and the, yeah, for me this is really difficult to navigate. Yeah, I myself, I am trained in different healing practices, but it's not something that I offer to people, and I, yeah, because also of my background, I don't know, it's a little bit also the belief systems that are also in the practice, and we take as assumptions, and sometimes we don't even talk about. But but that was like a big challenge. Like it was my biggest challenge, I think, organizing that retreat, dealing with that challenge.
Yeah. What this thread is bringing up for me is, especially if the orientation was what Amanda was suggesting, that community, what that's collective presencing was the foundation, the base for allowing community to become whatever it wants to become. So then the practice is no longer just a practice that we're engaging with. And yeah, and so inevitably stuff's going to come up. And so what does it look like to both consciously exclude those for whom it doesn't make sense to be in the center with that practice at one time or another, and that can change from context to context. And this is I recognize this is a topic that I've sort of circled around a lot in different conversations. And and in that as well, also like recognizing when I am not in a place to be that in a place where I'm not available to be sitting in the center engaging with the practice, recognizing that for myself, and consciously excluding myself. But then if community is centered around this practice, then having sort of what Michael was pointing at, but I think Michael was pointing at more than this, more of an ecology of practices that go along with collective presencing, but something adjacent being the, I was going to say safety net, but like some structure in place to catch those who need some other kind of support, so that we're not, I think, like maybe Sabra was saying, suddenly sort of not doing the practice, hold that loosely in quotes, because we're needing to care for or be with something that's in the field that is not that is needed to help us bring us back to presence, like we've fallen out of the circle of presence even completely. And so yeah, so there's already structures in place, so it's not that we're excluding these people from the community just because it's centered around this practice, but there are, yeah, that's being held as well. And but yeah, when we're just having like drop-in sessions that aren't centered around community, then yeah, then there's a deeper question of how to hold that.
I'll just say briefly, like, my experience of our circle here in Portland kind of responding and adapting to these kinds of situations has, in one sense, sometimes I have the feeling like, oh, we're not really doing collective presencing, like we're not even there yet, we're still just sort of like priming the field and like getting folks kind of on-ramped, enough folks on-ramped to the point where we can like start to have more of the kind of experience that I generally associate with the practice. On the other hand, it has expanded my understanding and definition of what the practice is and can be. And noticing that part of the feeling I just described is a certain kind of like belief story judgment box of like what the practice is and isn't, and that being challenged by my direct experience of doing the practice with other people. And so that's kind of interesting to see how the form, my understanding of the form and my relationship to the form is also evolving because of the ways in which it's just the kind of like taking a thing that I'm familiar with from over here and bringing it over here kind of like changes the thing itself, you know, and I'm then having to change how I am in relationship with that thing as well.
I'd like to pick up because I want to share that I am feeling some real terror at what I'm going to try, which is not only to introduce the practice to people who don't know anything about it, but then to also add a piece of nature connection work. And I just got a confirmation during our time here that this is a go with a local group called the Folk School. But holy shit, I have no idea how this is going to work, or if it's going to work at all. It could be a total failure. And but in early October, that's what I'm going to try on a beautiful piece of 140 acres riverfront. I'm hoping the land will hold us if Marianne can't do it. So yeah, thanks for hearing my, oh my God, what am I doing? Because it feels big.
Is it possible for you to have a co-host, Marianne?
I have someone who is good at being at holding a group field, but no, I don't have anyone else with any familiarity of this practice.
We are with you, holding from afar.
Exciting. And if you knew absolutely what you were doing, it wouldn't be as exciting, you know. And I love that, you know, Michael raised questions about innovating, and here in real time right now, this kind of you know, general categorical conversation we're having is like kind of finding a concrete instance right now that just came in the midst of this conversation. So a lot of what we've been talking about, and one thing I want to raise, is the question of Marianne drawing on support from the, you know, field of people who are practicing as you step into the awkwardness and the unknown of trying this out. But yeah, I think I'm feeling the energy of support and excitement from those who are here and what you're doing. I think it's awesome.
And I'll just say, like, that particular innovation of bringing in the land and the earth feels so essential. And so, like, good for you for going in that direction, because I feel like it's the kind of thing where you'd be doing it inside for however long and then have the idea to go do it outside and see what happens. And then you're like, why haven't we been doing this the whole time? You know? So,
you know, my thought is that to share the structure that I'm imagining is to introduce the practice and just orient people to the basics of the circle, the dialogue, but with the understanding that we're then going to spend an hour or an hour and a half wandering on the land. People will just go out and be drawn wherever their fascination calls them. And then when we return, we'll talk about what the land shared, what was learned, what happened with using the guidelines of CP. And if anybody wants to tell me about any suggestions, thoughts, watch out for, let me know. But that's how I'm imagining this.
Amazing. Love it, Marianne.
I wanna tell you, Marianne, that yesterday, so Sabra and I also host another regular gathering that we call that's called Rewilding the Soul. And yesterday I was imagining something very similar to what you're describing. Like normally we would listen to like a Dharma talk and then have a council practice about it. And then I was thinking, what if we just went out on the land and listened to the land and see what the land has to say about rewilding the soul? And then we come back and we talk about that. So we're picking something up in the field.
I have something, Marianne. I've done something similar to that with council circle practice out in wilderness areas. And the one bit that was really potent was when people go out in the land, they were directed not to speak to any other people. So even if you cross paths with somebody, you do not speak to that person. So it's a very personal 90-minute or whatever experience that you bring back to that circle afterwards.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, I'm feeling something coming forward, and it's just resonating with what Michael was saying earlier about how over time the sense of the bounds of what this practice is actually about, they grow more porous, or they extend, or they become more fluid over time. And something that Sabra was saying, which was opened up such a rich field of inquiry, like just scratching the surface of it. I'm pretty enlivened by it. But the question not only of prerequisites, right? Like if we're just trying to do the circle of presence, right? Like what criteria ought to be in place, and we see when things come into the field that prevent that from cohering. But there's also the sense in which the circle of presence practice itself was a training ground for things that I could not have brought in as a prerequisite without having actually been trained into it by virtue of doing the circle of presence practice, right? And I'm just imagining, Marianne, that what you're doing, if I had tried to do what you're suggesting before I'd ever practiced collective presencing versus trying it after much practice of collective presencing, it would probably open up quite a bit more. I think that some subtle capacities have been trained by virtue of this practice that are very much supporting what you're trying to lead people into. It makes a ton of sense. It's very exciting to me. And on that note, there's just one thing I want to circle back to that David had mentioned, that it was subtle what David said. And he asked about, in that initial awkward zone, what do we do about when people are speaking across the fire, maybe presumably shifting attention certain places, or discharging the awkwardness, or trying to evacuate it such that it's actually forestalling the coherence of what we call the circle of presence. But then you just slipped it in there, David. He said, but I'm also noticing that in the collective presencing field, we're beginning to slide across the fire more. And I got the sense that what you were gesturing to there is something different. You're saying that you're starting to see sliding across the fire in a way that doesn't seem like the thing you were pointing toward before. And so it's it's when things start to loosen up a bit, when we have this presence thing down and we don't need, again, like the training wheel is starting to come off a little bit and that fluidity starting to open. So yeah, there's this whole conversation has been like a very rough sketch topography of a lot of the terrain. It's opened up a lot of imagination around the varieties of practices that can come up, kind of disabusing me of the idea that there's some single thing that we need to figure out and get right, you know. So yeah, just excited by this and feeling appreciative. Just wanted to name that.
Thank you, Sam.
Can I share final words here, checking out? I think it's just a reminder for me that I was introduced to the practice through the Stoa. So what I got the practice was like, it was for me, it was those 90 minutes. But if I look back to Ria's book, it's not really, that's just like it's one possibility that came out of the pandemic, and it's like one iteration of the practice, but I think there are many, and people can discover different branches almost. It's like, yeah, so this is what I'm living with, is just, and I think it's important to, I see that how I don't know, it's like an intrinsic feeling when I know that I made the practice my own practice, and then I feel like I can share it however it is. And it's not like a external validation. You were a practitioner now. It's more like, oh, I feel I can really bring that forward. And then I don't know if I'm doing it right, but it's just intuition. So yeah.
No, we'll probably be closing down here and saying goodbye in about 5 minutes or so. So just noting that, and then want to, yeah, invite whatever's here, whatever might want to come forward.
Check out. Thank you, Sam, for initiating and organize this. I feel it feels important and valuable to stay attuned to these other experiments that are happening, and to like do this kind of sharing the learnings and integrating that back into the field somehow kind of process that feels really good. Yeah, and then I also just wanted to like pick up on these last two comments. Something that Brandon and Sabra and I have both talked about as far as like hosting and introducing the practice to others, but also in terms of how our relationship has been evolving, is this idea of like living the practice, you know, that like the 90 minutes of sitting in circle is kind of like your 20 minutes a day on the meditation cushion. But the point of that is that it becomes a stable place from which to live 24 hours a day, you know? And then the form kind of like fades into the background, and you're into this like spontaneous expression of the realization, like Amanda was just talking about. So yeah, I get really excited about that as a kind of a North Star to orient towards, acknowledging that we're just barely getting on the bike with the training wheels and starting to figure out how the pedals work. But also like, yeah, sensing the possibility for what it could be like to ride downhill with no hands, and, you know, swerving back and forth and just feeling really free and graceful and powerful in that, you know. So yeah, just want to throw that out there for myself and whoever feels drawn to that idea. I like, that keeps me inspired.
I think that I'm feeling like there's sort of this what is it, the circle of presence and the circle of creation, like you know, there is like this like channeling of God and like that happens, you know, like when it's on. And like if it doesn't get there, it's skill building. And like the skill building is really important. It's like really important. And like maybe it's not as juicy, you know, but like it's really important. And kind of like in the circle of creation, it kind of feels like some concept of like emptiness or God or animism, you know, is kind of like essential, like to tap that. And like not everyone's gonna come with that. And so just letting it be okay that in the skill building, we taste that, we're introduced to that. And kind of, yeah, like Marianne, I just felt this like in the terror, it's like show up anyways. It's really important. It's really important. Like this is service. It feels like service.
And you know, Sabra, what I just remembered, the name of the land that this will happen on, it's called the Learning with Meaning Land. That's kind of cool, you know.
I think that's a beautiful note to end on, everybody. Yeah, awesome. Thank you all so much for leaping in and animating and enlivening this inquiry, especially in this last moment here is really rich. So feeling a lot of appreciation.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye,
Thank
everyone.
you, everyone.